Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the short delay. Thank you for joining us today for the Indiana Department of Transportation's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI for short, virtual open house. My name is Diane Newton. I'm a national practice consultant in the areas of ITS and emerging mobility for HNTV here in Indiana. We're helping INDOT to develop their state NEVI deployment plan. I'm going to give a quick overview of the agenda and then introduce our speakers for today. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items to mention. First, this webinar is being recorded. For those who are unable to attend today's session, the slides and recording will be made available on the INDOT NEVI page, and you will see that link a little bit later in the presentation. Second, all attendees, as you heard, are in listen-only mode. You will be able to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar in the Q&A box on your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, and we will follow up on any of the questions we don't get to today. The agenda will begin with an introduction of our speakers before providing an overview of the federal NEVI program and INDOT's approach to developing the state plan. Next, we'll take a deeper dive into the approach and activities planned for engaging with the various stakeholders around the state as we develop and finalize the plan. As I mentioned earlier, we'll conclude with Q&A. We have about 30 minutes of presentation planned with the remaining time allotted for the Q&A portion. And as I previously mentioned, we'll cover as many questions as possible in that time. Today's speakers include Scott Manning, the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Indiana Department of Transportation, and Carrie Garvin, the Executive Director at Greater Indiana Clean Cities. Scott Manning was named the Deputy Chief of Staff in June of 2021. In this role, Scott represents INDOT in community, legislative, and public endeavors, manages special projects, and identifies process improvement to achieve maximum stakeholder and agency results. Scott has more than 10 years of experience in communications, serving in various private and public sector roles, most recently serving since 2015 as INDOT's Strategic Communications Director, where he developed and executed communication strategies to raise awareness of INDOT policies and programs. Next is Carrie Garvin, the Executive Director of the Greater Indiana Clean Cities, Incorporated, a standalone nonprofit advancing communities with education and resources on alternative fuel vehicles across the state of Indiana. Carrie is a frequent speaker and panelist at industry events and conferences, sharing information about Greater Indiana, alternative fuels and transportation, funding opportunities and resources. As the Director of Greater Indiana, Carrie works with government, universities, equipment manufacturers, fuel providers, and other key stakeholders to expand the use of alternative fuel transportation and infrastructure. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott to walk through the federal program and INDOT's approach to developing the state plan. Scott?
Thank you, Diane, and I want to thank everyone that has joined us online today. We're excited as an agency to be carrying this process forward and to engage with all of you on delivery of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan within the state of Indiana. We thought it would be helpful here at the outset to give some background around the program, what we hope to accomplish, what some of the guidelines are in which we'll be working, and then talk specifically about Indiana's approach and how you will, as members of the public and stakeholders, play a role in helping to shape our plan for the state as it relates to delivering EV charging infrastructure. So the National Electric Vehicle Program was created through the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that passed in the fall of 2021. One of the goals laid out within that law was to create a national network of at least 500,000 electric vehicle chargers across the country by 2030. To accomplish that, each state within the country is allotted what are called formula dollars, so federal funding through the infrastructure law that are specifically for the purpose of developing a plan and ultimately acquiring, installing, operating, and maintaining electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Indiana will receive approximately $100 million of the total $5 billion that will be available across the country and federal formula funds through the program. There are also additional opportunities for electric vehicle charging in the form of competitive grants, and there will be approximately $2.5 billion of competitive grants available over the life of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which runs for the next 5 years. So next we'll talk about some of the guidelines around the NEVI program from a technical and delivery standpoint. So if we can advance to the next slide. This gives you a little bit of a sense of where we are in the timeline as far as delivery and development of the plan. I mentioned the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill was passed and became law last fall. There's been a lot of work that's been happening within the state and across the country since the bill became law, and there's a lot of work yet to come, which we'll talk about as we move forward, but wanted to give you a sense of where we are now. Alternative fuel corridors are something that has been a program that's been available through the Federal Highway Administration for a number of years. States have had an opportunity to designate corridors of priority across their state highway networks where they see need and opportunity for investment in alternative fuel infrastructure, including electric vehicles. Indiana has had a number of alternative fuel corridors designated dating back to at least the last five years and prior to that. And Indiana has focused mainly on the interstate network across the state to provide continuity across the state, regional, and national network. And as we look at the next round of alternative fuel corridors nominations, which are due later this week, as a matter of fact, Indiana will be submitting our last two interstate routes to be designated as alternative fuel corridors. So we're reaching an important milestone here in the state in which we will have our entire interstate network within the state of Indiana designated as alternative fuel corridors. That is particularly important as it relates to the NEVI program because AFC corridors are the first set of corridors that will be available and eligible for NEVI funding to be used to deploy charging along those routes. The next, so that is work that has been going on since passage of the bill. INDOT has been working closely with the state's Office of Energy Development on those alternative fuel corridor nominations. Those were submitted earlier this week, and we look forward to approval of those final two routes and having our state interstate network fully designated. The phase that we are working on now and will continue over the next few weeks and months is development of our state EV implementation plan, which is a requirement of the federal Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Each state is required to put together an implementation plan that outlines how we intend to invest in electric vehicle infrastructure and our goals for utilization, and also making sure that we're serving a diverse set of end users, both rural and urban areas and across multiple socioeconomic categories, as well as several other requirements that we'll talk about here in a moment. So that plan is due to the Department of Transportation and Department of Energy Joint Office for federal review by August 1st, and the timeline for that plan being approved would then be approximately the end of September, and would set us up for the next phase of NEVI, which would then be talking about deployment. So actually working with partners to acquire the charging stations, implement them along the AFC corridors, get them up and operational so that they're available for EV owners to utilize and see those benefits. So I mentioned the plan is a federal requirement. The funding that is allotted to Indiana, we will not be able to begin using those dollars and investing those dollars until the state plan is approved. So that's a critical path item for us. And a major component of that is public involvement, which is a process that we started a few weeks ago with a request for information that was made available online for anyone and everyone to respond and give some feedback on the program. And we're continuing that public engagement process with this first virtual open house today. So we're excited to continue that process forward and take another step toward delivering our state EV implementation plan. So if we can advance to the next slide, we'll share a little bit more detail on what the NEVI program looks like from a technical requirement standpoint. So I mentioned that the federal funding that's available for EV charging infrastructure through this program must be invested in designated alternative fuel corridors. Within the state of Indiana, our alternative fuel corridors that are designated are the interstate system. So some examples: I-65, I-70, I-74, I-80, 94, I-64. So we have alternative fuel corridors that touch really every region of our state and will play a critical role in providing charging station availability across the state and also the regional and national network. Within those AFC corridors, there is a requirement that stations be placed no more than 50 miles apart to make sure that we have adequate coverage as EV owners drive within the state, but also regionally and nationally. That maximum of 50-mile spacing between stations ensures that each state has availability of stations and proximity of stations that can service EV owners and reduce range anxiety for EV operators on long distance trips. Stations themselves, in addition to the proximity of no more than 50 miles between stations themselves, they need to be located within 1 mile of an interchange or intersection. So as EV owners are traveling across the network, they'll have peace of mind knowing that they will not have to travel too far away from those designated AFC corridors to be able to access that charging infrastructure when there's a need. The types of chargers that we're talking about through this program are DC fast chargers, so level 3 charging, and in many cases it varies across vehicle types, but these will be the types of chargers that will provide up to 80% charge in about an hour or less. So these are high capacity, high speed chargers that will be funded through the NEVI program. One important point to raise, a question that in our initial discussions with many stakeholders, a question that's been raised is whether rest areas and welcome centers along the interstate network will host these NEVI funded charging stations. The answer, at least today, is no. The current federal regulations prohibit state DOTs from being able to sell fuel and sell fuel at rest area locations. And so because of those restrictions, we will not be able to deploy EV charging infrastructure at rest areas, and we'll be looking at locations at other interchanges. So just wanted to clarify that point and let folks know the answer to one of the most common questions that we've heard to this point in the discussion around the NEVI program. As we sort of fast forward and look beyond the implementation plan, one of the major next steps will be formulating and putting together the framework for purchasing and installing and operating and maintaining these charging stations across the state of Indiana. So we'll be working with our partners to develop a contractual framework to go forward for a model for deploying this infrastructure and making sure that it operates reliably and that we meet all of the state and federal guidelines, and that we have a network that is easily accessible and convenient and equitable for all of those who wish to tap in and use it. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what we are hoping to include in our state plan. So one of the items I mentioned earlier as it related to our AFC corridors is very close partnership with the state's Office of Energy Development. We recognize as we deploy this charging infrastructure, there will be a significant need for very close coordination with our power providers across the state of Indiana to make sure that we have available, reliable power to feed and support this growing network of EV chargers. So that coordination has been ongoing for the last few months and will continue throughout the life of this program. I mentioned public engagement is also a critical component of the program. We're very much interested in hearing from as many different stakeholders as we can that have an interest in electric vehicle infrastructure and how this funding can provide benefit for EV users, but also for local communities from an economic development and placemaking standpoint, and supporting long-term economic and community development goals across the state of Indiana. Some of the other requirements of the program are making sure that we have a network that is equitable, that serves customers not in all corners of the state, in all areas, both rural and urban. So we'll be focusing on looking at ways to make sure that we accomplish those goals. Also having a network that's data connected so that we can track the usage of the EV charging infrastructure and ensure reliability. And we'll also be, throughout the course of the plan, looking very closely at the supply chain and workforce implications as we move towards delivery of the charging infrastructure network. Obviously, over the last several months, there have been many challenges around supply chain and delivery times for materials, and that is certainly something to which the EV charging infrastructure, hardware, and installation space has not been immune. So we'll be looking at that very closely, continuing to track developments there and make sure that we contemplate those implications and how they will impact our implementation plan going forward. And we'll move ahead to the next slide. So at this point, wanted to talk briefly about the approach that Indiana is taking as far as development of the plan. We are very much hoping to find a blend and a balance of a data-driven foundation and public engagement and public input. And just want to here briefly mention that we have a great research partnership with Purdue University and the Joint Transportation Research Program. Over the past couple of years, Purdue has been on the leading edge of doing research around the existing charging infrastructure network within the state, the availability projections in terms of EV ownership and adoption over the coming years, and identifying where we have charging infrastructure gaps, charging deserts, if you will, across the state. So we have a great data foundation that will inform where we have opportunities to invest through the NEVI program to provide charging infrastructure in areas where we see opportunity to meet demand, where the current market may be not serving to a level that fully meets the EV demand that is out there, or the EV demand that is coming in the next few years. Beyond that, we know that there is a lot that can inform our plan, from conversations with individuals, with business owners, with city, town, and county governments, metropolitan planning organizations. So we want to make sure that the dialogue that we have with all of you feeds into and complements the data that we have available and the data that we're continuing to source over the next couple of months as we build out our plan. So that gives you a sense of some of the inputs that will be feeding in, and just want to close on the next slide by giving you a little bit of a sense of a little bit more depth on the timeline for delivery of our public engagement plan. Mentioned Just a couple of benchmarks. One that was notable earlier this week, our AFC nominations for the state of Indiana. We submitted our final 2 outstanding interstate routes earlier this week. Having our first virtual open house today, and you'll see that as we move into June, we've got a number of upcoming public engagement opportunities. We'll have 3 in-person meetings across the state, have an online survey opportunity, and then as we move into July, you'll see our first iteration of our state EV implementation plan will be submitted to the Joint Office for Federal Review. We'll have an opportunity to get some feedback of any edits or additions that may be suggested by the Joint Office, and then a final submission by August 1st. So we have an aggressive timeline, but we're excited to be able to offer several opportunities for engagement and public input starting today, but also having a number of follow-ups over the next few weeks as well. So hope that you'll stay tuned in and stay engaged throughout the process, because as you can see here, this is really just but one component of our public engagement, and we're looking forward to growing from here over the next few weeks. So some of this we mentioned already, just a picture of the state EV infrastructure within the state of Indiana. You can see there visually the corridors that are designated across the state. Great geographic representation. And I said, as I mentioned earlier, Indiana's set up really well to build out a network within the state that complements the regional and national network. And you can see some of the inputs and deliverables that we have accomplished so far on the EV charging infrastructure front, and how those will play into to our plan going forward. So at this point, we want to give a little more detail on the public engagement process for the plan and how you particularly can play a role. And I'll hand it off here to Carrie Garvin. As Diane mentioned, Carrie is the Executive Director for Greater Indiana Clean Cities, and are playing a vital role for us and a critical partner in leading the public engagement effort for us on the state EV implementation plan. So Carrie, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. If you guys can just give, Scott, can you give me a thumbs up, or someone let me know you can hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. All right. So today, as Scott mentioned, I will highlight the public engagement strategy that will help inform the state plan and upcoming opportunities for stakeholders to provide feedback. Public engagement is a large part of the information collection and development phase of this plan. There are 8 public engagement objectives the program team has identified, including gaining insight into market motivations that drive investment and activity into EV charging, gauging the level of interest in funding opportunities, participation, and engagement with other federal funding sources, identifying key planning considerations for EV charging build-out, identifying gaps by gauging which communities are likely to be underserved, as outlined by the Justice 40 initiative, and assessing readiness by identifying where we are today and where we need to go to successfully implement EV charging programs. Defining success by gaining insight into metrics and performance monitoring techniques. Clarifying INDOT's role by determining how the department can support implementation. And lastly, identifying unknowns and determining other considerations for the plan development. Based on guidelines from the Federal Highway Administration, Indiana's public outreach will include particular stakeholder groups. Stakeholder engagement will continue throughout the program's 5 years to reflect updated guidance, funding streams, and stakeholder needs. The 7 main stakeholder groups are the general public, which includes community-based organizations, grassroots EV chapters, and underserved or underrepresented communities. Another category is government, including state agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, municipal and county governments, public transit organizations, the EV Product Commission, and the 21st Century Energy Task Force. Another category is labor organizations. Another group is private sector groups, such as charging providers, original equipment manufacturers, and infrastructure and energy alternatives. We're also looking at consumer and investor-owned utilities, freight and logistics organizations, and of course, academic institutions. To date, the following outreach has been conducted. The Indiana Department of Transportation and Indiana Office of Energy Development released their RFI, which closed on April 29th. They were collecting comments and data for consideration in the drafting of the state EV implementation plan. A questionnaire has been developed to gather vital information from Indiana's utility groups relating to funding and incentives, site installation and connection, equity and environmental justice, energy generation, and strategic and long-term planning. Today, we are holding an informational webinar to provide an update on the plan development process, engagement strategies, and opportunities. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the INDOT NEVI webpage. Moving forward, there are additional opportunities to engage through in-person and one-on-one virtual meetings with INDOT. An online survey will be released this week to gather direct feedback from stakeholders. Responses will be accepted until June 8th. The in-person meetings will be held on Thursday, June 2nd in Northern Indiana, Thursday, June 9th in Central Indiana, and Tuesday, June 14th in Southern Indiana. More information about the in-person meetings, including meeting times and locations, will be included on the INDOT NEVI webpage and sent through INDOT's email list, so be sure you sign up. In addition to the scheduled in-person meetings, INDOT is setting up one-on-one meetings upon request. You can find more information about the NEVI formula program, guidance for states, and Indiana's plan at the links on this slide. And again, this webinar is being recorded and the slide deck will be available on the INDOT NEVI webpage following the webinar. And can't leave you without our contact info. So here's the contact information for our team. Feel free to reach out to one or all of us. To best direct your inquiry, please note that to request a meeting with INDOT, contact Scott. To get involved in the engagement activities, contact me, Carrie. For inputs and comments on the plan, contact Diane. And now I will ask Kaylee to facilitate the questions that have been entered into the Q&A box. So take it away, Kaylee.
All right, so we'll have everybody come back on with their webcams. Great. So Scott, we did have quite a few questions in here regarding the process for the RFP that is going to happen once the funding comes in. I'm wondering if you can touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, there's a lot yet to be developed as it relates to sort of the contracting and procurement component of the NEVI program. One of the variables there, which I mentioned is probably the most notable, is this is all dependent on submission and approval of our state EV implementation plan, being that that's a federal requirement to access the funding. So we have been and will be over the next few weeks having certainly a significant focus on delivering that plan, working with Diane and her team and Carrie and her team to make sure that we deliver on all of the components that were outlined on the list of what's required in the plan, and making sure that we submit that in a timely fashion and work with the joint office to get that approval. But as we're doing that sort of on a parallel track, if you will, you know that Diane's team is looking at and working with stakeholders to identify what are those contracting methods and models that are most viable and sort of give us the opportunity to get the program off the ground as quickly and as efficiently as we can, but also make sure that we deliver the best value and best quality of work and best reliability for the taxpayers and for the EV owners and operators that'll be using the infrastructure. So I can't really speak to specifically, you know, timelines, requirements, standards and specifications. We don't have an RFP process or framework drawn up yet, but I can tell you that we're certainly mindful of that need, and we are looking toward the next phase of this process and very much see the state EV implementation plan as informing what that next level, next step of this process looks like. And you know, we will absolutely have opportunities, formats like this virtual open house, information on our webpage. We will be very proactive in making sure as we get closer to rolling out that RFP framework, that everyone that's engaged in the discussion will have input in that, and then also certainly have opportunity to review that and participate as they see fit to do so. So throughout the implementation plan, Carrie just mentioned we've got a robust public engagement approach, but that's obviously going to continue beyond plan submission and into the procurement and deployment stage. And I will also throw out at this point too that we very much see the state EV implementation plan as a living document. So this will not be something that we complete August 1st and simply gets memorialized. This will be something that will be revisited on an annual basis. It'll be updated. Public engagement will be ongoing, and we will have defined goals within the plan that we will report metrics on and benchmark where we are from a progress standpoint and make adjustments as needed. So there'll be input and opportunities to engage every step of the way. We don't exactly know what procurement looks like, but we do recognize that there will be a need to develop that and have that picture come together more clearly as we go through plan development. And Diane, I know that you've had some conversations across HNTB as you have a larger team that are developing plans not only for Indiana but other states, and I know there have been discussions around RFP and procurement. If there's anything that you want to add on that component. I think you may be muted, Diane.
There we go. Sorry about that. As Scott mentioned, we are helping several states with their state implementation plans, and that is certainly the approach we're taking with Indiana is to present the contracting alternatives, including things like a P3 model, a local public agency model, a state agency model. You know, some states are even considering some kind of, payment models. So we're putting these together, outlining what they look like and the pros and cons for each of these approaches. And then I do expect that's kind of what we're doing in May. And when we have the public meetings, the in-person meetings in June, I do feel like we'll have an opportunity to do a deeper dive on some of these topics, especially where we're looking for stakeholder input on what the preferred models look like. Certainly INDOT is driving and providing their preferences, but we want to hear from the stakeholders as well as we finalize what contracting looks like. Contracting and procurement are a big part of it. And as Scott mentioned, we do feel like the August 1st is sort of a plan for the 5 years. It will be updated, at a regular cadence, whether that's annually or more frequently than that, in terms of what and the timeline for RFP and what contracting looks like. All that detail will be added into future versions.
Great, thank you. We also had a question looking at the first initial funding is coming out for the building out the alternative fuel corridors along the interstates. So there's questions about when the other areas could receive that funding. And I know initially that's to build out those corridors, and then later once they're built out, we'll be looking at the other areas. Scott, I don't know if you want to build on that at all.
Yeah, so as it relates to the language within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the NEVI funding is required to be invested in the alternative fuel corridors at the point at which all of those designated AFCs within a state are deemed to be fully built out, which is which will be sort of defined by USDOT, by the Federal Highway Administration. At the point at which the state has all of the AFCs built out, have that determination from Federal Highway Administration, there would be an opportunity then, if there are remaining funding, if there are remaining formula funds available through NEVI to the state, to then invest in other corridors that are not designated as AFCs. So in terms of being able to invest those in routes other than the interstates, it will largely depend on the timing of building out our AFC corridors, and then what that looks like just from a total investment standpoint, and whether there would be dollars remaining in the program at that point. I would also mention, I briefly touched on, there are $2.5 billion in competitive grant opportunities for EV charging infrastructure. That is separate from the NEVI program. Those are not tied to alternative fuel corridors, and the eligibility is wider for those competitive grants. So state DOTs like INDOT are eligible to apply, but state metropolitan planning organizations, cities, towns, counties are also eligible to apply as well. So there would be opportunities on the discretionary and competitive grant side to pursue federal funds for EV charging infrastructure for routes that are not designated as AFCs, and to be able to sort of pursue those at the same time as the state is working on the NEVI funding and delivering along those alternative fuel corridors.
Awesome. We did have a question. Are the responses to the RFI going to be made public? And if so, what does that timeline look like?
So the RFI responses, we received about 45 of those from a wide variety of stakeholders, and we're going through reviewing those as we speak. We asked a multitude of questions and got significant depth of responses from many of the individuals and organizations that chose to respond. So we're in the process of reviewing those and getting those into sort of a digestible document, and working towards what making some of that information publicly available looks like. But given we were pleasantly surprised with the number and depth of responses that we got. Would just ask for patience with our team as we work through those responses and get to a point where we can turn around and share some of that information with folks that are interested in the insights learned through that RFI process.
All right. And then we also had questions about maintenance of the charging stations once they're up and running. Some people are concerned that is something that needs to be considered in the plan. I know that there's definitely been looking at that, but can you touch on that?
Yeah, the NEVI program contemplates operations and maintenance, which I think is it's noteworthy that as this was contemplated at the federal level and discussed in Congress, that there was a need recognized that if we as a country are making a significant investment in EV charging infrastructure, that we do need to be mindful of making sure that it is maintained, that it's operational, that it's reliable, because if not, we're not able to see see the program benefit EV adoption and see reduction in range anxiety and achieve some of the benefits and the outcomes that the program hopes to achieve there. So the bill does allow for federal funding to be used to cover up to 5 years of operations and maintenance. And so that will be a piece of our ultimate RFP and procurement and contracting structure, is that we will have an expectation for the partners that will be participating in this program in terms of the installation, the operation and maintenance of the infrastructure, that they do have a commitment to O&M, and that they have a plan that they can share with us to demonstrate how they will keep charging infrastructure operating and maintaining and in good working order, and also be able to report back to us on metrics that speak to reliability, like uptime and utilization. So that's something that we're very much mindful of. It will be an expectation as we go into the program, because we recognize that for there to be success in this program and for us to get the return on investment that we're making, that we need to ensure that these sites are not only available, but that they're operational, and that folks can have the peace of mind that when they pull into a location to charge and plug in, that the charging station will be working, and that there will be power there to recharge their vehicle.
So once the plan is drafted, when and if will the stakeholders be able to provide any input before it's submitted? Or review it, I guess.
So I think this goes back to some of the iterations of public involvement that Carrie spoke to. We're building the plan out now. Diane's team is taking the lead on crafting the actual plan and document that will be submitted to Federal Highway. So as we continue that build out process, we'll be able to share what that looks like as we move further along into public engagement. I think Diane alluded to this earlier. As we get into the next round of meetings that we have planned in June, we'll be able to talk about progress, update where we are in the development of the plan. And so I think our vision would be that there would be opportunities in those touch points, as well as interaction online through our website or through the emails. Carrie shared the contact information, which is on your screen there. I think we see this being very much a two-way conversation and dialogue to have folks inform the plan as we continue to build it out.
And I'll just add on to that. I do feel like the public engagement chapter, which you saw, it's focused, it's very granular between now and August 1st, but then there will be phases that go beyond August 1st, because there will be many more opportunities to engage. But with the limited time that's available to put the draft plan together, we're trying to take as much information as we can between now and about the second week of June, as you saw. So we inform the plan as much as possible in the event that there's not that lengthy opportunity for public review prior to a July submittal to the federal joint office.
Great. And we did receive a few questions regarding grid enhancement and making sure that that is prepared for these additional charging stations that will be installed with this funding. I know we've had conversations with a few utility groups. I'm not sure if you can touch on how the plan is going to be taking that into consideration as it's being submitted.
So that's a great question, and it's one that our team at the outset of this journey to develop the implementation plan, was and is very much top of mind for us, is recognizing that need to make sure that as we identify sites within our AFC corridors for potentially siting and hosting this type of EV charging infrastructure, that we have available power and grid capacity to support those operations. So, and Diane can speak to this in more detail, but her team has been doing some extensive mapping, looking at where our AFC corridors are throughout the state and layering that with power availability. Carrie also mentioned we have a questionnaire that we're sharing with the utility sector, the power providers within the state, to get some more detailed information from them to help us better understand where we have any needs or gaps that may need to be filled, or any concerns from the standpoint of power delivery and power availability. And at the same time, again, that close coordination with Office of Energy Development, with the power providers within the state, one-on-one. We've had those conversations and will continue to do so throughout the development of the process and on into the implementation phase, because we certainly recognize that the utilities are a critical partner in being able to deliver this program and deliver it successfully.
That's correct. Yeah, the two chapters, the existing and future conditions analysis and the EV infrastructure deployment, those two chapters specifically are heavy on the mapping exercises and the analysis of anticipated usage rates and peak demands and where there may be issues. This really is intended to be a plan, and that includes identifying potential gaps and problem areas for future years of the program to tackle, as Scott mentioned. So that's why the plan, it will be important to identify these potential issues so that we can plan for them for future years of the formula funding.
Yes. We also had a number of questions about where some of these resources can be found. So the INDOT NEVI webpage, I'm going to post a link in the chat shortly. On there, any of the research that is public will be located. We're going to have the state plan, the engagement plan will be located there. And there's also links to some of the guidance federally, the alternative fuel corridors, and the webinar recording will also be located there when it's ready.
Yeah, thank you, Kaylee. I would just add on top of that, if you haven't yet checked out the page on the INDOT website that we have established for EV charging infrastructure, would encourage you to do that, to click on the link that Kaylee's providing through the chat, and perhaps bookmark that if it's something you want to revisit, because much like the plan itself, that will be a living, evolving space where we'll continue to add resources. Our public engagement plan, which Carrie walked through, that's already available on the webpage, so you can download that, print that out if you need to. We've got access to some of the research that Purdue has been doing around electric vehicle usage and existing charging infrastructure and gaps. We'll continue to add to that as that research is built out. And then, as Kaylee mentioned, we've got links to the federal guidance to information on the alternative fuel corridors. And finally, we also have a link there to sign up for email updates. So if you're on our email list, that's how you receive the invite to the webinar today. But if not, or if just perhaps you just want to double check to make sure you're subscribed, we've got a link there where you can subscribe to our email list as well, so that you'll get ongoing updates. So that webpage will be a great resource going forward.
Yes, and the 3 stakeholder sessions that will be taking place in June, that information will be shared as soon as it's ready. Once we have all of those details, that will be shared with you. The survey, it will be released again, through the website and the email list as soon as it's ready. So that should be with you shortly. Those are two great opportunities for you to provide feedback, even if you're not directly on those interstates. So we want to hear from all of you because it is a working document, that 5-year plan. So we want to try to have as broad of a look so that we can have the most robust plan as possible. And then I think our last question here, for those site hosts, those locations that are not necessarily within that 50 miles or they're less, we will still be looking at those depending on the circumstances. I know that there are opportunities depending to have those included. Can you touch on that at all so that people have a little bit more of an understanding of you know, when they should maybe let us know about those instances that might be opportunities?
Yeah, I think that's an important point to emphasize, is that the existing EV charging infrastructure across the state, and that includes both the existing level 3 DC fast chargers as well as the level 2 chargers that are deployed across the state. We very much are looking to capture that network, the availability, the proximity, the usage. We very much want to capture that and be inclusive of that in our plan, because at a high level, what we're looking to accomplish within Indiana, and this goes back to a little bit of what I shared as far as our approach for the implementation plan, is to leverage the federal funding available through the NEVI program as much as we can to complement or supplement where the existing market is providing EV charging infrastructure. So in some areas, we see adequate or above adequate coverage of available EV charging infrastructure relative to the adoption and EV ownership today, and in some cases, even into the future. So what we want to do is make sure that we have very good awareness of where those existing charging stations are, any charging station deployments that are planned here in the near term outside of the NEVI program, so that we can make sure that we're making strategic investments in areas that are not duplicative to the market. So we're not serving areas that already exist and have adequate charging infrastructure, but really meeting that demand that is not sufficiently yet or not at all met today. So that's something that we're going to be very mindful of, and we will welcome public input and guidance from you all as we continue to collect that information. But I know that's something that Diane's team, from a mapping standpoint and documentation in the plan, they've been very proactive in identifying that existing charging infrastructure landscape.
Wonderful. We haven't received any new questions, so I think we've covered everything. If we did not address your question directly, we will be following up through email, and we will have a document on the INDOT NEVI page for commonly asked questions and answers from this webinar, so that everyone can view those even if they weren't on the webinar. Okay, and this webinar is recorded, and you will receive that following the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.